All right. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for the PNAMP Fish Monitoring Workgroup Carrying Capacity Data Standard Task Meeting. A couple of housekeeping tips before we get started. One more slide, Jen. Please mute yourself by clicking the little microphone on your Teams platform. Sometimes you need to wiggle your mouse a little, and the toolbar will pop up either on the top or the bottom of your screen. You should see something similar to what Jen has up on our screen right now. If you're on the phone, use *6. Next slide, Jen. If you have any questions or feedback, one more, go back one more. Sorry. If you have questions or feedback, please choose the chat function. Basically, you can push the little thing to raise your hand and unmute yourself. This is such a small group that if you want to just unmute yourself, you don't need to raise your hand. Or if you feel uncomfortable doing that, you can always type your questions or feedback in the chat. We are recording this meeting, and it will be available on our YouTube channel probably about next week. Now, if you want to open up that chat function and introduce yourself with name and agency, that helps us keep track of participation. Next slide, Jen. Today's agenda, we're going to cover an overview of the charter, just super quick. The proposed process to engage people in the product development. The task team leads will cover the draft task description and outcomes. Tim Copeland will do a general overview and background. Morgan Bond will talk about development of proposed guidance for carrying capacity products, and Russell will wrap it up with introduction to framework of a concept data standard in relationship to existing exchange standards and systems. And then we'll just kind of open up the floor for feedback from you guys, solicitations of ideas, and kind of a general timeline of what we're looking at. Next slide, Jen. So I'm going to cover the charter just super quick. Let me put a link to the charter in the chat for you guys, so you can just go to our website. Sorry, that took me longer than expected. To access the charter, it basically just covers a description of the group, the goals, and what to expect if you plan on participating. So you as a task team member basically means that you've responded that you have interest in this topic, and that you'll help the task leads kind of guide the task by attending meetings and providing input. So this leads me into the engagement process. It is likely you're already on our mailing list, but if you have interest in accessing documents or other information via the Microsoft Teams platform, then you can sign up in 2 different ways, just kind of depending on if you're Department of Interior or not. I will also post that link in the chat. If you go to pnamp.org and the Fish Monitoring Workgroup project page, it'll give you the 2 alternate ways to do it if you're DOI, if you're not, and then I can sign you guys up. We can also help you out if you can't. If your agency doesn't let you access Teams, the task team leads can figure out ways to send you information so you can review documents. And I will drop that in the chat so you guys can sign up for Teams if you want. And now I will hand this over to Tim Copeland to talk about the task description.
Okay, so can you hear me, Meg?
Yep, loud and clear. Sound great, Tim.
Okay, good. So just to try to kind of kick things off, it's like, where are we starting from and where are we headed? And so we've kind of come up with a draft justification of and we can certainly modify any of this stuff, but really this idea of carrying capacity has a long history, and it has kind of a natural appeal to fisheries managers and restoration planners. But there are lots of different flavors, and practitioners might not know about all these things. And so, the purpose of this task is to improve the understanding of these various models and their products and how they might be applicable or not to management decisions. So that's kind of where we started from. And certainly I have a lot of trepidation about the term carrying capacity myself. I mean, it's not really something that occurs. It's something that could occur. It's a potential, right? And it probably doesn't happen very often, if ever, and we can't really observe it very well. So, there's a lot of hazards there. But I mean, if managers would like to know something about population potential in order to implement projects aimed at realizing that potential. So this is a useful exercise. So, with that's kind of the marching orders in my mind. And what we're hoping to do is to provide some guidance for that and the means to have folks access what's out there and enhance the understanding and communication. So I was given 10 minutes, but I certainly don't think I need 10 minutes. And um, that's me trying to I guess tee up some discussion. I certainly, like I said, I dislike the term carrying capacity, but it's already out there and people put that term on it. So I can't really think of a different one, but maybe that's something that we discussed today. So that concludes my remarks for now.
Jenna, if you want to go forward.
Sorry.
Hey, before we move forward, I'd like to just bring up some of the Yakima Nation's concerns about this. And especially, one of the things that gives me a little confidence this is, Tim, your background with the Idaho supplementation study. But some of our concerns are using carrying capacity to try and justify existing potential versus mitigation obligations, right? When the dams were built, there was existing fish populations. There was a known decrease in capacity that was going to happen because of the construction and operation of those dams. There's a mitigation package and obligations developed. And now we're 40 years later, and lo and behold, we don't have fish. And, we hear folks like the Independent Science Review Panel saying, well, you can't keep throwing in hatchery fish to meet these mitigation obligations because the background habitat can't support it. And it's basically redeveloping the mitigation obligations using carrying capacity. And so that's sort of our concerns on this. Certainly appreciate the scientific interest in developing these types of models and trying to certainly prioritize where we're doing habitat restoration and building production capability and capacity. And so I just wanted to make sure that we mention that and discuss it, and that we do this exercise with our eyes wide open. There are limitations on what carrying capacity can do for you. I think it is an important indicator and an important analysis and assessment. But the concern, of course, as a fish manager, is that those opposed to mitigation obligations or, trying to justify new developments can use carrying capacity in the wrong way. So we just want to make sure that that is front and center in the conversation, and that that's considered as we work through this effort.
Thank you, Tom. I agree. I think that's one of the things that we want to have discussed, and I agree with you that there's definitely distinctions in historic carrying capacity and markers and benchmarks that are used for management targets, and the different types of carrying capacity, whether it's habitat carrying capacity today, or for the potential and what we're seeing. Those things are all the cautions and the things that we need to be able to define and understand when somebody's looking at a tool or a product, what it means. Tim, go ahead.
I just point out that in the second paragraph of the current justification, it starts off that there's a high potential for misinterpretations and abuse. So that is the point.
Go ahead, Morgan.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an interesting avenue. I guess one of the, like Tim was just saying, there's potential that people don't really understand what they're using or producing necessarily, or where it's going to be used. And I guess I'd be sort of curious. I don't know if we want to get into that right now, but Tom and others, from your perspective, what, given that we're trying to put together these standards for, things that people are producing sort of regardless of our process here. I mean, so lots of folks are producing capacity estimates for lots of different flavors for different initial purposes. And hopefully, the outcome of this process is that we get essentially a little more clarity about what those things mean, but we don't really have any real control of it. If we stop this process, it's not like people stop producing capacity estimates. So I guess I'd be sort of curious about what the sort of proposed solution for someone taking estimates and trying to use them as a club or whatever is. Like, what's the solution, given that the sort of box has been opened, I guess? If anyone has ideas about that.
It's a little off nice way. Well, I think it's a nice way to express it, Morgan, to help people think about it from the other side. Because when we came upon this task, when this first idea came up, like a year ago or something, was that the documentation around the models, both how they're generated, how they could be applied, what their intention was, and also my big thing was the inputs going into the models. Boy, if we could understand that and have good documentation on that, that gives, one of my passions is helping people access standard information and understand what information is useful and necessary to people, right? We don't have to share all the data. We want to share the important data. So to me, it was more about documenting inputs, documenting methods, understanding appropriate use of outputs, as opposed to, we're not driving information towards any it's the right word, but my understanding, we're not trying to create things for any particular purpose. We're trying to help in general improve documentation, both inputs and outputs, so that there's a better understanding. So, all right. So anyway, I interrupted Morgan's good point about trying to help us understand. And I think Bill has raised his hand. So I'm going to stop. Bill, take it away.
Well, I think Tom Iverson laid out the Yakima Nation's concern pretty well. I would just add a little bit here. I mean, we know that carrying capacity is limited from historical, right? I mean, there's historical estimates of 9 to 16 million salmon coming back to the Columbia Basin. Now it's 1 to 2 million salmon annually. I guess I'd like to hear some discussion about what's the intended use of data or carrying capacity information when you eventually get this built. You set standards, people are going to start populating these indicators. I assume that's the eventual intent here. How do folks see those data being used by whatever the user base is? And I kind of ask a question back to Morgan. In an era where everybody's telling us there's a limited pot of money to spend, that we need to tighten our belts, we can't really do more, we need to do more with less. Why should we be spending money on this when we know that natural productivity and carrying capacity are issues? Wouldn't it be better to spend this money on trying to figure out ways to get rid of the 5 to 7 or 8 million shad from the Atlantic that are coming into the Columbia River and inhibiting potentially Pacific salmon productivity because of their abundance? Certainly there are ways that we could increase natural productivity if that's the concern here, the ultimate concern that's driving this task. Anyway, I would like to hear some discussion on how you folks see these indicators being used by whoever might use them.
Morgan, do you want to answer that one question first? I can jump in
Sure.
on some of these things.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I guess you're right. You know, we're in a time of limited funds. Why are we doing this? Well, you know, remember, and one thing is that there are many groups that have their own sort of uses or needs for producing these estatements that may fall outside of, you know, the people in this room, right? So a lot of people that have come up with capacity estimates for a variety of reasons. I think one of the big ones is, in a time of limited funds, we're often trying to identify what the limiting factors are. I mean, you talk about shad, like for any given population, are shad a problem? Maybe, maybe not. So we're trying to identify limiting factors, and capacity estimates can do a pretty good job, I think, to the fact that we have the data. Again, this will get into this later, but if we want to know where restoration is going to be the most effective, it's nice to see, and oftentimes these things are used to what's the current capacity and what changes to the system will result in an increase in capacity, and is that increase in capacity coming at a limiting life stage? So in some places, restoration dollars, let's say, may be sort of wasted if it's not really benefiting something that is limiting that population. And so I think capacity estimates for a lot of groups are sort of a first cut at trying to identify, maybe from a reach-based approach, what is the current capacity of the system, and if we make changes through restoration, what would be the increase or the lift in the capacity of that system? That's, I think, how a lot of people are viewing these types of capacity estimates that come at a pretty fine grain, and it's going to increase through time. And we're going to be coming up with finer and finer estimates of capacity. And as Tim mentioned, is sort of from these habitat-based models, giving us not just a current or contemporary capacity, but maybe historical or potential capacity based on the type of restoration that we do. And that could be any number of things, from reconnection of disconnected habitat to flow restoration, et cetera. So depending upon the flavor of model used, the type of information we're going to get is going to be different. But I think that's from my view, where I sit, that's sort of the primary purpose is trying to identify these limiting factors and put restoration where it's going to be the most beneficial based on the information we have.
So I'll jump in to answer other components of what Bill was asking, or at least my attempts to identify some of the information, how we apply or try to use this, or what I'm seeing. And one of the things I've noted in my time with BPA and with NOAA is that we have a lot of different products being produced and consumed, and the idea behind data exchange standards and sharing information is to know that if somebody produces a carrying capacity estimate for a population and says this is the number, it'd be good to know the citation, the source, and the information associated with that. So we know, as you were saying, Bill, there are carrying capacity and targets that were established for the hatchery practices and purposes. The intrinsic potential has stuff. NOAA has stuff from ESA documents. There are new products that are being produced from the QRF estimate and the IRA process in the Salmon River in Idaho, as with Idaho Office of Species Conservation. There's another product that was an offshoot of fish density that I'm working with Dan Isaac to do block creaking, to do fish capacity based on existing fish use. And part of this is, a requirement of the current BIOP to use carrying capacity and habitat carrying capacity to guide where restoration could be occurring based on where fish actually are today and where they have the potential to be based on the potential of the habitat. So, there are products that are being produced, and one of the things that we've seen in the efforts from, Biomark, Merck's group to produce the QRF product for the IRA is the different GIS layers. And, they had one phase and one product that used a different hydrography network. Then a second phase was just produced recently, and it linked to Morgan Bond, has a globally available attribute GIS layer. There's the another globally available attribute layer with the Northwest Hydrography dataset, or a national hydrography dataset. So the questions that I was starting to get as we were working, I've worked with Dan Isaac, I worked with Kevin C, starting to work with Morgan and his efforts, is how can we share, some of the common information and ensure that, that information is available, consistent, and available to other people who may want to run those same capacity models so that they can be compared to understand what are some of the products. But one of the other things that we recently found as well is that for me, as one of my jobs, I'm trying to make that data available to our restoration practitioners and our habitat team. If we have a GIS product that is just a product that is produced, the ability for somebody in a different watershed restoration group in the Grand Run Model watershed, for example, to have the skill set to read the paper, reproduce that GIS layer, put it on a tool, understand it and interpret it, and know the 16 different variables that they have is challenging. And also the things that we've seen are coding and the attribution itself of, HUCs, populations, related names, goes in all sorts of different fields and layers. And that if we can do something that allows the common attribution of these data sets, it helps consumers and users, use the data or evaluate the data a little bit better. But I think the big thing that we're looking at is, again, making sure that there's associated documentation that, hey, this QRF product was just produced by Biomark. What are its applications? What are the right intended applications? And who do you contact if you have questions? Because absent that ability to contact the people and use it and understand it, there is a lot of potential for misuse and understanding what's out there. And as I said, I'm trying to just try to document these tools, show some comparability, and show for what these products can do. And I'll show it later that I have an example that shows the NOAA's intrinsic potential layer, Beachy classification, StreamNet's fish distribution layers, the QRF product, and habitat are all common layers. And what does it show about fish use and across the Columbia Basin to potentially guide restoration practitioners? There's a second side of that, which is that's the reach-based carrying capacity. But I've also seen carrying capacity at a population level. Population level estimates that are being produced to set recovery viability targets within the BIOP, or other things that would say, these are the areas that we need to be focusing on to help, guide some of those things, or understand where your potential is to do work, which population should you be working on. So I think there's a lot of different things, and the list that you see here is task outcomes. I think we're hoping that this group can discuss guidance for appropriate carrying capacity estimates, produce some documents that we can share, talk about these different indicators and the things that we should be exchanging out, as well as exchanging for use when you produce these things. So I think there's another outcome that we had, I think it's number 6. One of the things that we've seen with the FTAT product produced by Dan Isaac, and talking with Tim, who's involved, is that a lot of different scales of monitoring is used, and if the monitoring could be guided from these models. The life cycle models need more. If we have some specific guidelines as biologists, or the modelers have guidelines that these data sets probably need to be broken up, not a summary by a reach that's 5 kilometers, but give us reach estimates every 50 meters, give us something else. What are the data inputs, and what are the best ways to do designs? Do you design a snorkel survey based on a stream reach of a certain habitat or a stream order? What are some feedback that we can give that may make some real life data more consumable? So overall stop there, and that's what, sorry, this is what we want to probably be discussed within this group, and see what kind of products we can produce and share on the PNAMP fish monitoring work group to guide these conversations. Over.
Hey Russ, Bill typed in the chat and Tim responded, but Bill's question was, so do you see these indicators mostly as input to life cycle models? And Tim responded with, those types of applications are already out there, but I didn't know if you or Morgan wanted to answer that question either.
Pointing to Morgan, I'll let you go first, Morgan.
Well, yeah, I would say, yeah, I don't know about mostly, but yes, we're definitely, I mean, from NOAA's perspective, NOAA's sort of biting hard on life cycle models right now. And so we're definitely doing a lot of habitat work that will serve as inputs to various life cycle modeling efforts, for sure. But I think different folks have different uses. And in some ways that's great, right? Because in this time of sort of reduced funds, if, there's no sense in every single group reinventing the wheel, if somebody can produce large scale estimates that others can use for their purposes, that's great. But that really speaks to this need to people, having to understand what it is that they're getting, whether they want to build their own models and they're looking for data, or whether they're looking for outputs. We have to have really good documentation of that when people start borrowing from different locations to try and create something for their own needs that may be a little bit different than the original use. Yeah, Russ, did you have something else you wanted to add on that?
I think you've covered it, and I think this, as we continue our conversation, we may hear a few more things. And I think the population level carrying capacity estimates and the products may be out there. Right now, we have more tangible examples in life cycle models and products that we are sharing, but there are some cases where people are trying to produce estimates for populations. And how do they share them? How do we exchange them? I think those are worthwhile things to make sure that people continue to document. So just one thing I'd like to do just for this meeting. I want to back up 1 second. I think we talked about the charter, but I just wanted to say that Tim Copeland, Morgan Bond, myself, we've kind of been volunteered and joined this group as task leads, and there's more opportunity for other people to join us. And our goal is to help this task team really lead this initiative, figure out what kind of products that we want to work on, and kind of orderlize. And so this meeting today, we're going to talk about these potential outcomes, what's most important for people, who's available to engage on these, and if people are producing these types of products and want to engage, what do we do, and what's more important to them? So we just want to hear from people what's important and what's going on today.
And that might lead us into our next slide, Jen. Morgan's going to talk about the development of the proposed guidance for the carrying capacity product.
Thanks. Yeah. So
wait.
Oh, yeah.
Do we want to pause and discuss more, or is that enough? Know that one of the intended things, we have some ideas that you see today about what you already saw the list. We're going to talk a little bit more detail. And then, at the end of this meeting, we'll circle back around and have a little discussion. Is that fair? So Bill and Tom, and if anybody else had concerns that didn't share them, know that we want to hear your reaction to these ideas. And then if we need to adjust that task description and the proposed outcomes, the task leads will do that after this meeting. So I guess maybe we'll let Morgan see what he's going to say. Sorry, but it felt like just for closure on the discussion, I appreciate people bringing up their concerns. And I think what would be the best is if this task helps address those concerns, not put fuel on the fire, but to say, we heard Bill say he's very worried about inappropriate use, or going. I'll just leave it at that. So maybe there's a way we can help Bill with that and the Yakima Nation with their concerns, as opposed to, we're definitely not just shining them on Bill. Help us understand how the tasks can be adapted to support what you're worried about and prevent those bad things happening, for lack of more eloquent words. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take a pause here if anyone else wants to talk some more about. I don't want to stifle the conversation by getting into the weeds here, but if anyone has something they want to jump in with. Looks like Tim, you have some thoughts here before we move on.
Well, back at the last slide, if you look at what's the first task, it's the guidance, and I think that is the most important thing to do. And I think that's what addresses a bunch of the concerns that folks have expressed today, is that we have some guidance for what's appropriate and what's not.
And Tim, one of the things is that list by the team we developed, we put them kind of in order of what we thought was most important to discuss and potentially developed. And that's what we'll come back to at the end and get more feedback from everybody. And that, we thought the guidance is a really important piece to start with. And through order, and at the end, we would eventually get to, where do we share these products? What do we do? But those are the things that we thought were important with this topic. So thank you.
Okay, well, I'll get into this, and then it seems like we can kind of circle back on all these things. I think one of the things that, and this slide is a little wordy, and I apologize for that, but I think one of the things that's difficult is that there are just a lot of different ways that people are estimating capacity right now. And again, we keep kind of going around different purposes for these things. And this is tricky because if you're not familiar with these, you may not know what the outputs are. The flip side of that is if you think you need capacity estimates, but you're not sure which approach to take, you're sort of equally stymied. And so we think some kind of a documentation of these different approaches and where they may be best used, along with the data needs, would be really useful for folks. And this is actually something that I've talked to the group about this for a while, but something I started working on a few years ago. And this group may be an opportunity for me to sort of pick that back up. But I first started doing some capacity work a few years back, and I started trying to dig in to figure out what it was that people were doing. And one of the first things, right off is that we were throwing around the term capacity, but of course, the capacity in and of itself is very, if we're talking just about salmon here, it's very life stage specific, right? Some people are thinking about spawner capacity. Is there enough space and good gravel, temperature, et cetera? Whereas other people, when they use the word capacity, are almost, universally talking about juvenile rearing capacity. But we have to be really clear about that. What is the capacity that we're even discussing? And so sort of that first step, I think, really is identifying that what that capacity really represents. And so we need to come up with some sort of standard, I guess, or ideas about what capacity means in that way. And it's going to be pretty different depending upon the life stage that we're talking about. And the other is that, and Russ got to this, there are the two kind of really broad classes of capacity people are coming up with right now are these reach-based estimates, which are very habitat focused, right? It's like, what kind of habitat is here, and how do we build that up into some kind of a perceived capacity, versus the flip side. A lot of these population estimates are essentially, if they're not just a rolled up breach capacity, a lot of these are sort of stock recruit models, and they go back to, ideas that were developed in the 30s and 40s, thinking about, how many fish come in, spawners in and juveniles out, essentially? And do we see some kind of density dependence in that relationship? And in between those, we have all flavors of trying to come up with those capacity estimates. In this slide, I put, for reach-based capacity, I put fitting approaches, and then I put mechanistic approaches. Again, that's just kind of how I think about these things in my head, but they're really different. These fitting approaches really take those what Russ called globally available attributes. It's like, what do we know about the characteristics of each reach of the stream? Can that inform capacity? What's the slope or gradient of a reach? Is it really, really steep? Or is it, a pretty flat reach? That's going to have big implications for the morphology of the system, right? Is it really confined, et cetera? Those are the globally available attributes. And then how we apply fish densities to that varies wildly. You could just say, look, I look through the literature and capacity is really built up from, it seems to be juvenile Chinook rearing capacity is X number of fish per meter of water. Let's just apply that to how much water we think is out there of a particular quality, versus these QRF, as Russ mentioned, or quantile random forest models that Kevin C has done a lot of, where you're really taking the actual raw fish data and trying to estimate capacity from that. And there's sort of benefits and drawbacks to each of those. These mechanistic approaches are a bit rare at large scales, primarily because it's essentially most of these are sort of a bioenergetics approach. Intrinsic potential is kind of a mechanistic light, I guess. But then there are more detailed approaches, people trying to estimate, where in the stream can a fish be and have positive growth versus negative growth. We assume areas of negative growth are going to be unoccupied and build that up through time. That's really different from these sort of fitting approaches, really, really different perspective and data needs. And so I think that because these things are so different, that it's really nice if we can document these different methods and what the sort of general use cases are and what the data needs are for these things, because there's a lot there, and I think that would go a long ways towards helping people understand either what they're getting, or if they want to build one of these, what they need in order to do that, and talk about some of the kind of benefits and drawbacks of each. I'll do one more slide if we can move to the next one, and then maybe there's some time for discussion. So again, I've sort of put the cart before the horse here. I talked about some of this stuff, but depending upon your perspective, which of these model flavors you choose may really be limited by either the available data in your watershed or extent of interest, or by the question itself, right? And so my examples here, if all we have are estimates of spawners in a particular watershed, and maybe we've got a screw trap, so we have estimates of long-term estimates, let's say, of juveniles out, then we're probably going to be estimating on a population scale some capacity from one of these stock recruit relationships, because that's essentially what we have to work with. On the flip side, if we need to know, we're about to do some flow restoration, and we need to know, is this going to be a lift for the population? Is this going to increase capacity, and where? Then we might take one of these bioenergetics approaches that's going to use some high resolution hydraulic modeling to really identify where is water going and how are fish going to be benefiting from that seasonally. The sort of last example again would be, if we have these globally available attributes, or we have some habitat information at a relatively fine grain for an entire watershed or for a population of interest, and we have a lot of fish data, so we've gone out and surveyed fish, then the QRF or quantile random forest models may be a good approach, because you sort of have the building blocks that you need take that method in place. So again, because these vary so much, it really seems like we need a standardized sort of description of what the inputs for these models are, and what the outputs represent. One of the big ones, and I think Russ is going to talk about this later, but are we talking about area, square meters, or are we talking about lengths of stream, for every kilometer of stream, this is the capacity. So that has a big difference in how you interpret what you're getting, and yet we tend to mix and match a little bit, maybe a little too cavalierly. Do we have habitat attributes available, and at what kind of grain? And then finally, is there locally available fish density data? A lot of times there isn't, and so we're borrowing from other places that we feel are similar, or either in life history, or maybe similar attributes of the habitat, borrowing where we can. And that's done because a lot of places we don't have locally available fish density data, and so these are sort of the aspects. Again, it's a lot to wrap up, and I think that's exactly why we could use some more detailed discussion of these methods, what goes into these types of models, and what the outputs are really representing. So we can have some discussion about this and about the earlier stuff, I think, because we're doing, or if Russ wants to move on to talk about the data exchange standards, we can do that too, I guess.
So yeah, I'll jump in on the data exchange standards discussion real quick, and then again we'll try to open it up.
Is that, wait, I see Tom is visible. So Tom, do you want to ask a question on that last slide, or do you want to wait?
I'd rather talk about it now, I think. I mean, it sort of is about the data exchange standard, but Morgan, you did a really good job of presenting how complex this information is. So just in listening to your discussion, thinking about the variables and what a data exchange standard is, it makes me just wonder how much time we're going to talk about. It's almost that each model needs a data exchange standard, right? What is the appropriate way to present the results from a particular model, and say the metadata in a way maybe, but so it'll be really curious as we work through this. And so I'm sure Russell will start talking about this next, but really, are we, because the data, the variables used for each of these models you don't use the same set of variables and parameters, and so a data exchange standard, you can't capture every variable and parameter that's used in any model. So do we need to be talking about what are there some standardized models we need to be talking about, or whatever? So, and I'm not saying this looking for an answer. I'm just thinking out loud about this task, and as we move forward. And so, so I'll look forward to Russell's presentation on the DES.
Thanks, Tom. I think your comments are correct that there are going to be a lot of additional outputs and things that will vary based on what people use. But if there are things that we're seeing that are in common, we'll go ahead to the next slide. We're hoping that part of this will be, well, what are some of those standards that we want to produce if you export a product? So you can make them in common terms. If you produce a species estimate, we're seeing people use patagogus codes, species runs. And so when you try to sort all this information and aggregate this information, a species, a run, a code, all these different things, play. Also, there's summaries. Are you using these watershed HUCs? Are you using these, USD, NRCS HUCs, or are you using something else? There's lots of things that I've seen so far that, come into when you produce a result, how do you make sure that those are common and, comparable, just as some general guidelines. And you know, I think the very first thing is, you know, are you using fish per meter squared, fish per meter cubed? What are your outputs? Make sure you have those so that people can compare it. You know, if one product was put fish per 100 meters and one product was put in their paper, you know, a guideline is, you know, fish per meter, you can't really necessarily, you know, you can, you know, doing the math in your head, compare it, but it doesn't make it as easy when you see things in different blocks and different information. So based on my work with coordinated assessments, I've been doing some preliminary work with another group, which will be meeting with data exchange standards for screw traps and snorkel surveys. Some of the things that we are talking about in those products come out in here, and we've got a draft document on the Microsoft Teams folder that we'd hope to get people to look at, and it talks about, well, how do you define a reach? What are those reaches? And then, you know, if you produce a data set, what are those standard attributes that you should be producing in your data set so that people can find it, access it, know the author, what's your protocols? But you can see in this field as an example that, you know, what's the species common name, what's the run, what's the life stage? Having some definitions around those things are important. And if we can agree to some common output fields and what those may be, it will help make some of these things more comparable when people try to display them. So I guess the questions I ask is, you know, what's important to share and what is important to use? So if this group can come together and say, when we produce our outputs, these are the things that we're producing. Here's our values of, you know, fish per meter, Chinook, steelhead, different life stages. What is it that people report? And then again, you know, if you have these different layers that people are using, if you are using NRCS HUCs, if you're using population names, having the codes that we get from the coordinated assessments for unique population names would be helpful. You know, these are the types of things that I think are just, you know, the guidelines of things that we've started down the process of trying to document what would be in a common exchange. And my effort so far has been, you know, taking 4 outputs, whether it's, you know, the FTAT carrying capacity estimates, the QRF estimates, intrinsic potential, and StreamNet's fish distribution layers. You know, not all of them are carrying capacity, but they are products that people use in common that are important. And I think the last example, we were just having a conversation. Kevin C. I seen us join. I was having a conversation with Kevin C. and Brian Mashoff, and we were talking about their outputs. And one of the things is that, you know, their outputs extend through the main stem non-wadable streams, but, you know, they didn't cut their layer by the migration corridor habitat, so they have estimates of fish capacity going through those areas. I think it's good to try to have some conversations around, well, what layers, what should we use, and how do we update those data layers if they get updated, and note that for documentation and models as things go through, that if something needs to be rerun again because there's a new layer and you shouldn't be comparing these because there's different things out there. So I think this is just, you know, introduction, that we have some spreadsheets and Word documents that we're trying to discuss the controlled vocabulary over the terms that are used in field headers, and eventually try to get into with some data specialists to, you know, potentially define some standards that are used. One example, I guess one last example, is when Morgan, your globally available attributes, your GIS layer that you produced, or one that's available on NOAA's webpage, is different than the 1 to 24K National Hydrography data set. The GIS layers in a different datum, you know, doing conversions and all those things. You know, how do we make sure that those are little things that, you know, can prevent people from making big errors in their data sets, that will help these efforts moving forward. Can you go to the next slide? And so just an example, one of the things that we want to talk about is how do you share your GIS layers, your core products? How do you share your code of the things that you may be using to consume or, you know, to define your outputs? And I put on Microsoft Teams here, you know, whether that's the codes sharing is in GitHub, our products with ArcGIS, or maybe StreamNet or some other places that people can share their products with documentation. I put Microsoft Teams as a forum and a place for us to share ideas, or potentially to say, here's products, here's the information, until we find some larger process to figure out how we're going to exchange this information and do a better job to ensure that something exists where if there's a group or form that can help us manage carrying capacity data better. In the center, I just had an example of a product that I've been working on that, as I said, compares intrinsic potential QRFs, streamnet fish use, species habitat models, and the FTAT estimates. And it gives us watershed summaries, by watershed, by population. It just depends on what you're looking at. But is it fish per meter? What's your total habitat? What are the different outputs that you can look at? So I think the question that we're looking from this group is, how do we share these products? How do we, inform and guide, some standards and exchanges for the information? And we recognize that, new models will come out with new layers and new inputs, and they may be different, but it's good to share it. But what are the core things that we should be looking at first, and then providing some additional guidelines around that. I'll stop there and go to the next slide. And so I think right now what we wanted to do is we said, here's a brief overview. We have 6 things that we've identified in this task group. But what we really want to hear is from the people on the phone. We know a couple people couldn't make it today, but we want to hear, where do you think this is resonating with you? Are there topics or things that you think are ripe for discussion and moving these products forward, and what's most important? Tim, Morgan, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I think you did pretty good, Russell.
I guess I would say, and this is partially in response to what Tom brought up a few minutes ago, like, well, if these things are so complex and everybody's using different data, then what is a standard? But I think that there either is or could be more carryover for a lot of these things than we realize. And maybe if there were standards that would, like I'm using I'm using a different projection or something on my GIS layers. Well, that's because we just picked something and went with it because we were working sort of in a vacuum. And maybe if there was a standard, we would have started with that, for example. Not to put Kevin on the spot again, but like Kevin C and I use a lot of the same. We have 2 different models, but we have a lot of the same inputs. Again, these sort of globally available attributes. We're both using a lot of the same inputs in our models. So there is a lot of kind of carryover. And so good documentation of those inputs benefits me and Kevin and anyone else who's developing these types of models. And as those things get updated, if we can document that, then that benefits, if Kevin produces some new globally available attribute, then I can probably use that in my model as well, or I might be able to, but I need to know what it is and what it represents. And again, I think a lot of this is helping with interpretation, but also with efficiency. I have a hard time often knowing where to get information, or if I do find something, what is it exactly? We want people to have good information about what's out there. And so having stuff in a sort of common format and location would be fantastic. That'd be the ideal. Yeah, so.
All right, guys. So basically, we're just going to open up the floor now to talk about the tasks. Do you guys see any issues with these tasks? Any red flags? Do you have suggestions for maybe different tasks that we're not seeing? I don't know if it's helpful to go back to slide 8 so you guys can see some of the task outcomes. Jen, if you want to go back a little bit. Yeah. Also, it's completely open if you guys still feel gray about the topic. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, yeah, if you came back to that task outcome slide, it will help. Thank you.
You guys can feel free to unmute yourselves.
So the parallel I'm drawing in my mind is the abundance estimates DES for the NOSA. And we certainly didn't dictate how you calculate an abundance estimate. There's a lot that goes into an abundance estimate. We just needed to report the abundance, what methodology was used, some of the underlying metrics. So if you're going to do that for carrying capacity, I just don't see it as being quite as simple, but maybe that's the approach to take. Is, are you really getting at fish per area, whatever that area is defined as, and for, you know, a certain geographic area, and how much other information do you need? You need your, you know, probably what model was used and what assumptions were made and that kind of stuff. But so that's what I'm trying to get my head around. I mean, carrying capacity is so much more complicated than abundance, and can be calculated in so many different ways at so many different scales that can be expanded to highly variable geographic areas. Sometimes it's good for, you know, well, maybe, and that's what we need to determine, right? Is it's good for that reach. Can't be expanded for a whole stream or watershed. So again, just sort of thinking off the top of my head, but how you would actually do a data exchange standard for population carrying capacity, I'm struggling with a little bit. Just trying to visualize what that would look like.
Do you, any of the task leads, have any feedback on that, on Tom's concern?
Tom, just my visualization, just as you said, is it Russell?
Russ, I think we're not getting very much of what you're saying, Russ. At least I'm not.
Yeah, it's cutting out.
My apologies. Unfortunately, my daughter's school date pickup time got moved up for an early release today, so less than anticipated.
Okay. I will jump in then. I know that Russ, we have a snapshot of a spreadsheet, Tom, that is in the Teams environment that is sort of that is a draft elements of a standard that Russ has put together based on, you know, some, I haven't really looked at it. So I will just say it's a draft for discussion and review. And I will say that it is possible that it is so complicated that it isn't as, the product might not be the same level of detail as what we have constructed for the NOSA or what we're doing for HCACs, for the hatchery indicators, right? It might be sort of a higher level standard, you know, recommendations for documenting and certain elements of a standard, but I don't envision it being, I mean, right now I have a hard time getting my head around getting it down to the level of detail that we use for NOSA, for example, where we can flow data to StreamNet and have it be consistent. I don't know that this will end up being that refined in level of detail, Tom. I think that is yet to be determined. I think we want to start with guidance for appropriate use. What are the elements of information that are important? How should we document the methods and the outputs? What documentation should be associated with that, right? And leave some room for evolution of this work as it goes.
Hey, Jen, this is Russ. Sorry, I think Mike is finally out of the dead zone.
You're definitely clear, Russ.
My main comment that I had was I do have an example for, you know, the population level is definitely completely different than the exchange for the reach level. And, you know, I do see a lot of parallels that if somebody is going to produce a population carrying capacity estimate and they roll information summaries, that they should at least provide some core information that, this is an estimate, this is the confidence interval on the upper and lower bounds, this is the population that they've identified, consistent with what we've done already in the coordinated assessments. So I think I have, and what's the method? What are the other elements that they capture there that would be necessary to exchange that information to ensure proper use as those things are produced? So I have a concept that we've started, and I think if people are interested and want to talk about that, that's when we'll start up a task group, present those products, and just get into that information a little bit more. And it's a discrete product from the paper.
Yeah, I would sort of echo a lot of what Russ is saying there. I agree that I don't know that. Obviously, we talked about the complexities of these things. So coming up with a single set of standards that's going to encompass everything is maybe less realistic than ensuring really good documentation of what's going in, exactly what data people are using to build their models, and what the outputs really represent. I mean, that if we just had that for put together for each model, I think we'd be in much better shape than we're in now. So I think that's kind of a minimum target for this type of data exchange standard. And it's worth noting, that there are other data exchange standards, right? Basically working in progress right now for things that'll end up being really important for a lot of these types of capacity models. So like the data exchange standard for screw trap data. Screw trap data becomes a big part of particularly these population level estimates. So this is going to build on several other efforts, really, in some ways, even though they're sort of parallel, because we're not wanting to wait until everything else is finished. So we're kind of working on that simultaneously. But yeah, because we rely on data from so many disparate sources, whether it be electrofishing, or snorkel surveys or screw traps, there are other data exchange standards for a lot of these other things that will become inputs. So that's just worth noting.
Okay, I've got to go. Russell, picking up his daughter, reminded me I have a 2:00 meeting that I'm already late for. But I appreciate you guys' work on this. Keep us involved. We want to stay up as participants in this and to continue working on it. So thanks.
Thanks, Tom.
Sorry, I've got to cut out. Apologize.
Understand. I'm going to throw out there that I see, it looks like Mike Bannock trying to type, but I don't see any content, Mike. So if you would like to jump in and just say what you're saying, feel free. My little chat thing just shows that you're trying to type.
Oh, I've been typing.
Into the
so I
chat.
think people, yeah. So yeah, I wasn't sure if I was going to send this or not. Carrying capacity is not my forte. But I think carrying capacity, like in and of itself, really isn't of interest, right? It's in comparison to existing fish population size or what the carrying capacity could be with habitat improvement work, I believe at least one person said today. And so my thought that I was typing out was that maybe those sorts of things dictate the geographic scale of interest in each case, because the geographic scale is something that's been discussed too, and what scale do we go with? Well, maybe the geographic scale in each case depends on what it is you're trying to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit it there. That the scale at which people are working is often completely dictated by what their sort of end game is, and if it's restoration in a particular location, that's pretty different from other estimates where we just want to know where is the population falling. This year we're looking at some of these stock recruit relationships or something, and we want to know how close are we to capacity, or do we even have a good estimate of capacity? So yeah, I think that's totally right.
I'd add to that. I think the spatial scale might also it might depend a lot on the data that went into whatever estimate of carrying capacity is being produced, right? And what's appropriate, what's not. The use for it could be on multiple spatial scales, depending on, like the output maybe you can generate something at the reach scale. Maybe it's appropriate to generate something at the population scale in the same method. But the input data might really dictate what your options are. I apologize for the noise. I've got workers in my basement that sound like my house is falling down.
Kevin, just a quick comment, or based on now that you're on the meeting and the conversation, one of the things I alluded to while you weren't there was just the benefit of being able to exchange and have discussions of code, posting those, and having a forum and being able to discuss these topics. I think is one of the benefits of this group in general. So how do we share it? What are those common things that we're sharing? What are those things? How do we document it? I think some of the next steps that we can be doing is, as we said, we do have interest in this paper. I think having a separate meeting and discussion on the concept of a population level exchange and the reach-based exchange, showing some more specific information in the future on those will be good to have, and inviting those people that want to participate. And I think one of the goals with this is just to make sure that we have streamlined dynamic groups who anybody who wants to participate can. And we just want, you don't have to join on. If you're on this topic just for one of these things, that's great. But we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to join on, or maybe to specialize on one or two topics. So I think that's one of the things we want to hear is, do these topics, sound right? And, Meg, do we have a way where you're going to track this, try to get, which topics people had most interest in or wanted to participate? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think we were just kind of going to do some talking today and see if we could prioritize, and if we couldn't, then do something with a follow-up.
Well, is there a sequence, that things A needs to happen before B? I think before you can do a standard, you want to agree on what are the important concepts, and then what associated information is necessary to support that, right? So we call it terms, the important terms we need to have, and defining those terms. And then if you have associated metric level information, perhaps it informs an indicator. It's a little different with these data, but have all that described fairly well, I think would be the starting place before you get into more details about definitions and actually any sort of exchange, right? And I think the guidance could happen simultaneously, but because that's a more general task, right? As far as the appropriate use guidance, I should say. We've already talked a lot about that. I don't know. So that's my sort of thing is, yes, as Russ said, people could, help with task A, B, or C, but some of them might need to be done sooner than others. And I don't have a clear answer in my head. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there for discussion. Maybe Russ and Morgan and Tim have a plan.
Well, it seems like that task one, there's a lot of interest in, this appropriate use. We've spent a bit of time at the beginning talking about that. And it's that's sort of independent. I see it as a lot of the other sort of information standards and stuff. They could definitely be sort of a standalone piece that we work on that doesn't require the other things either before or after, right? Do other people see it that way?
Yeah, the other things kind of number one here seems to stand out alone. The others are, how to provide the outputs, and the recommendations then flow from that. The documentation for the various steps. That's what the DESs are about. And then number 7 here, if this is going to be, if the group is going to function as a discussion forum, that's maybe an independent outcome as well. Just thinking on my feet here.
Anybody else have any other suggestions or what we can do? We're hoping to get feedback from a few more folks and then ask the task leads to sort of sift through the feedback and come up with a game plan going forward. So I know Kevin has been involved in some of the discussion prior, but I think you missed the last couple. So I don't know if the newer voices on the call, Bill or Haley or Sharon, put you on the spot. Sorry. It looks like Brian Mashoff has just joined. Don't know if you've been able, how familiar you are with this, Brian, so I won't put you on the spot. But we're just looking for people's feedback about, yes, boy, this is really urgent. Let's do this. Or I would like to help with that item number 3 or 4 or whatever. And then we'll come back around with a game plan. Okay. I know I think we had a few more people express interest who are not here. So I don't know if that's just a post-holiday thing that happened. And so we'll continue to share information widely. We also have a larger fish work group meeting coming up the 3rd week of January. So we can share an update there. And that might get more people's attention as well. Say, okay, the task has started. We've had one group meeting. We have some feedback. Maybe we revise the task description somewhat, and then make some progress. And in January, share that. Maybe we'll get a few more worker bee hands to the task. Not that we have to have more people, but we definitely would like to have more people review things later. It's a perfectly great solution to have a small group do some work and then have it vetted by a larger group later. That would be great. So I don't mean to diss anybody who's here today by any stretch. Meg, do you have specific questions for folks?
I don't think so. I think we're just trying to kind of figure out a timeline for everything and see if there was input from any of the participants that we missed as far as task outcomes. Right now, it just kind of sounds like everybody's marinating on it a little bit.
Right. Which is perfectly fair too. I think everyone on this call received an invite and materials from Meg. So you could, if you're not comfortable or you just need to think about it a little bit and then have some feedback, you could send that to Meg and she'll share it with Morgan and Tim and Russell. Or you could send it to Morgan, Tim, and Russell together, or any one of them, or pick up the phone and call one of them if that's your more comfortable route. We really do want to get feedback. Just
Lines
don't call
open,
me.
folks.
No, so that wasn't an option. Yeah, the lines are open. You order soon, you also get a Ginsu knife. Okay.
Bill, do you feel like you have any more input? Do you feel like this meeting has given you a little bit more clarity?
Just, I'm afraid that my feedback is more of a policy nature. My impression listening to this meeting is that this is mostly an academic exercise for academics. I'm having a tough time seeing how it benefits tribal objectives in terms of getting more fish back to the fisheries and to the spawning grounds. That's just not real clear to me. As I said earlier, I think we know what the problems are. The region spent an awful lot of money developing sub-basin plans that identified all the limiting factors. Personally, and I think my employer would agree that we'd rather see the money spent on actual actions to address those limiting factors as opposed to more academic studies or exercises like this. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, it sounds like everybody's got a lot to chew on. Jen, do you want to go to the wrap up and next step slide?
Hey, Jen, or just one quick thing, just process. As I said, one of the things, stepwise, Morgan has started on the paper and will probably be definitely one of the leads helping in that front. And I'll be one of the leads helping with the DES and the data exchange standards, because, the efforts that I've been involved in with different products we received from QRF, FDAT, and ongoing natures of people continuing to develop new products or updates within those. I would, while there's a need for a paper, I think that there are needs for exchanges and standards, and being able to discuss those will still happen, absent the paper. And so I think one of the things I'm just trying to bring light to is that if we can have those discussions, as we said, I'll continue to try to advance some of the exchange standards and common field definitions for those products. And it's not all or none, and we hope that we can get people to engage on these products and volunteer to discuss what's necessary or what's right for these as we move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. All right. So to kind of begin to wrap this up, this meeting was recorded in case you joined late. So if you missed any of the beginning elements of this, you could always go back and watch it. I will probably have that up this week or the beginning of next week and send you guys a link. The task leads are gonna convene after this real quick if you guys have just a short 5 minutes, and we'll decide on some follow-ups and kind of some asks for the rest of you guys, and send out some documentation and links to things so we can kind of keep this moving forward. Do you guys have anything to add before we wrap? Okay. All right. Well, thanks for everybody joining us today. Jen, if you want to go one more slide. As Jen mentioned, we have the next full group fish monitoring work group meeting January 20th of 2022. The task team will kind of chat after this, the task team leads, and we'll figure out if we need to have another meeting or kind of sorry, I was reading the comments. Kind of what the next steps are for this project. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Dreary after Thanksgiving afternoon. It's very much appreciated. And thanks a lot to the task teams and everybody that joined us today.